The underworld knows Rowan Jin-Seo as a man without a pulse. A predator. The undisputed king of the Seattle docks. His rule is simple: never stop, never look back, and never let weakness slow you down. But tonight, the rain isn't the only thing stopping his convoy. His security team reaches for their weapons, preparing to bypass the distraction. But Rowan stares into the child's hollow, terrified eyes, and sees a ghost he thought he buried 20 years ago. Stop the car. He didn't know it yet, but what that little girl was about to show him would haunt his conscience forever, and ignite a war of vengeance. The interior of the Mercedes Pullman was a fortress of silent luxury, insulated against the violent Seattle deluge by 3 inches of reinforced ballistic glass. Rowan Jin-Seo sat in the rear, the stark blue glow of an iPad casting sharp, angular shadows across his high cheekbones and tailored charcoal suit. To the rest of the city, he was the ghost running the shipping lanes, a man who calculated human lives in ledger entries and treated emotion as a fatal structural flaw. "Sir, shipping manifests for the Pier 91 cargo are cleared," his underboss, Mingyu, muttered from the front passenger seat. Rowan didn't look up, merely giving a curt nod. His mind was already on the next tactical move. Suddenly, the heavy armored SUV lurched violently forward. The tires shrieked against the slick, flooded asphalt, the anti-lock brakes pulsing hard under the floorboards. The entire 3-car convoy ground to an aggressive, synchronized halt. Instantly, the atmosphere inside the cabin turned lethal. The rhythmic thrum of windshield wipers was drowned out by the metallic clicks of 3 security men chambering rounds into their firearms. "Report," Mingyu snapped into his earpiece, his body instantly pivoting to shield Rowan. "Sir, there's an obstruction in the road," the driver responded, his hand hovering over the gear shift, ready to reverse. "Lead car says it looks like a trap. Advising we bypass by mounting the curb." Rowan looked through the front windshield. The high beams cut fiercely through the blinding, horizontal sheets of rain, illuminating a tiny, isolated silhouette standing directly in the center of the lane. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 5, wrapped in an oversized, sodden jacket that dragged in the puddles. Her small shoulders shook violently against the freezing wind, but her face was turned directly toward the oncoming headlights. She wasn't running. She was waiting. "It's a distraction," Mingyu warned, his eyes scanning the dark tree line flanking the roadside. "We don't stop in this territory, boss. Let the lead car clear her path." Clear her path. A clinical euphemism for forcing a terrified child into the freezing ditch. Rowan stared at the girl. Through the glare of the high beams, he caught the reflection of her eyes, wide, hollow, and utterly devoid of hope. It was a look he knew intimately. It was the exact expression he had carried in his own reflection 20 years ago, standing over his mother's broken body while the world passed by on the other side of the glass. A sudden, suffocating tightness gripped Rowan's chest, fracturing his icy composure. "Sir, we need to move." "Quiet," Rowan commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute weight of an executioner's axe. He reached for the door handle. "Boss, it's not safe." Mingyu protested, his hand moving to intercept. Rowan leveled a look at his underboss that froze the man in place. "I don't hide in cars from children, Mingyu." Pushing the heavy door open, the roar of the storm rushed in to meet him. Rowan stepped out into the freezing, relentless rain. The freezing rain hit Rowan like a physical blow, instantly soaking through his bespoke suit. The luxury of the Mercedes vanished, replaced by the raw, howling reality of the Seattle night. Behind him, the doors of the lead and rear security vehicles flew open in perfect synchronization. 6 heavily armed men stepped into the downpour, rifles raised, their tactical flashlights cutting erratic, blinding arcs through the dark tree line. Rowan ignored them. His leather shoes splashed into the deep puddles as he walked past the hood of his SUV. The little girl didn't flinch as he approached. Up close, she looked impossibly small, a fragile anomaly surrounded by idling engines, armor plating, and men trained to kill. Her lips were a frightening shade of blue, and her chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths. Rowan knelt on the wet asphalt, bringing himself to her eye level. It was an action his men had never seen him perform, the king of the Seattle underworld lowering himself into the mud. "Who are you?" Rowan asked. His voice was naturally gravelly, but he forced a rare, quiet restraint into it. "Where is your family?" The girl didn't answer with words. Instead, she took a tiny, hesitant step forward. Her freezing, trembling fingers reached out and gripped the wet lapel of his charcoal coat. Her touch was incredibly light, yet it sent a jolt straight to Rowan's chest, fracturing the armor around his heart. She looked up at him through plastered strands of hair, her voice breaking through the sound of the rain. "Mama." She let go of his coat and pointed a shaking hand toward a narrow, unpaved gravel driveway branching off the main road, leading toward a small, unlit house swallowed by the shadows of the pine trees. Mingyu moved to Rowan's side, his weapon still raised. "Boss, this is a textbook ambush setup. We need to get you back inside the vehicle. Now." Rowan stood up, his eyes locked on the dark house. The instinct that had kept him alive for decades in a cutthroat empire told him Mingyu was right. But the phantom pain in his own chest, the memory of a boy who once prayed for a savior who never came, screamed louder. "Mingyu, take 2 men and flank the rear," Rowan ordered calmly, wiping the rain from his face. "The rest of you, on me." "Sir." "Now," Rowan commanded. He didn't wait for a response. Striding down the gravel path into the darkness, Rowan kept his body slightly ahead of the little girl, shielding her from the wind. Sophie trotted to keep up, her small hand reaching out to grab the edge of his jacket once more. Rowan didn't pull away. Together, the Mafia Don and the child walked toward the silent house, walking straight into a nightmare that would change everything. The front door of the house was unlatched, swaying slightly in the wind and letting out a rhythmic, agonizing creak. Rowan pushed it open with a gloved hand, stepping into a suffocating darkness that smelled heavily of copper and damp air. Behind him, the tactical flashlights of his men sliced through the gloom, casting harsh, trembling beams across a trashed living room. Shattered picture frames, upturned furniture, and torn curtains painted a frantic picture of a violent struggle. Sophie immediately slipped past Rowan's legs, running toward the back of the house. "Sophie, wait," Rowan commanded, his voice sharp but controlled as he followed her. The beam of his flashlight tracked her small form as she skidded into the kitchen. There, the little girl dropped to her knees, her tiny hands immediately pressing against a figure collapsed on the linoleum floor. "Mama," Sophie whispered, her voice a fragile, broken sob that echoed in the small room. Rowan stepped into the kitchen, and for a fraction of a second, the breath caught in his throat. The flashlight beam illuminated a young woman lying in a pool of blood next to the kitchen counter. Her clothes were torn, her face brutally bruised, and a deep laceration near her hairline was still sluggishly bleeding. The scene hit Rowan like a physical blow. The clinical detachment he had spent 20 years cultivating shattered. In an instant, the clean linoleum dissolved into the cheap, cracked tiles of his childhood apartment. He was no longer a Mafia Don. He was a helpless 7-year-old boy watching his own mother bleed out while his father's heavy footsteps faded down the hallway. The phantom sound of his own childhood tears ringed in his ears. "Boss?" Mingyu's voice snapped him back to reality. The underboss had his hand on the woman's neck. Pulse is weak. Shallow breathing. She struck her head hard on the counter. "If we wait for a city ambulance in this storm, she won't make it." Rowan's eyes hardened, the vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of absolute, terrifying authority. The boy who couldn't protect his mother was dead. The man standing here now commanded an empire. "Call Dr. Kong," Rowan ordered, his voice cold as ice. "Tell him to prepare the private clinic at the estate. Move." "But boss, bringing civilians into our medical network." "I won't say it again, Mingyu." Rowan knelt beside the girl, gently but firmly lifting Sophie away from her unconscious mother. He wrapped his heavy, expensive coat completely around the shivering child, lifting her into his arms. "I've got her," Rowan whispered to the weeping girl, his chest tightening as her small arms tightly locked around his neck. "I've got you both." Mingyu carefully lifted the bleeding woman, and together, they retreated back into the howling storm, leaving the ruined house behind. The Jin-Seo estate sat high on the cliffs overlooking Puget Sound, a brutalist fortress of concrete, steel, and bulletproof glass. Normally, it was a place of cold business, a sterile command center where hits were ordered and millions in contraband were routed. Tonight, it felt strangely altered. In the private wing of the mansion, the heavy oak door to a guest suite stood slightly ajar. Inside, Sophie sat on the edge of a massive king-sized bed, looking impossibly small against the silk sheets. She had been bathed and dressed in an oversized cotton shirt, her damp hair neatly brushed by Mrs. Huang, Rowan's trusted, elderly housekeeper. Rowan stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing, his ruined charcoal suit replaced by a stark black button-down. He watched the girl silently. She wasn't crying anymore, she was staring at her hands, frozen in a state of shock that Rowan recognized all too well. It was the emotional paralysis of the broken. Mrs. Huang stepped out of the room, shutting the door softly behind her. She looked up at Rowan, her eyes soft with a rare warmth. She ate a little broth, Master Rowan. But she won't sleep. She keeps watching the door. And her mother? Rowan asked, his voice low. Dr. Kong stabilized her in the clinic downstairs. The head trauma is severe, and she lost a lot of blood, but she is breathing on her own. He had to place her in a medically induced coma to let the brain swelling subside. It's in God's hands now. No, Rowan muttered, his jaw tightening. It's in Kang's hands. Tell him if she dies, he'll need to find a new city to practice in. Mrs. Huang sighed, accustomed to his harshness, but she reached out and gently touched his forearm. You did a good thing tonight. Your father would have left them in the ditch. The mention of his father caused a visible flinch in Rowan's shoulders. His eyes darkened. My father is dead. Don't compare me to him. He turned on his heel and walked back into the guest room. The floorboards didn't creak under his weight, but Sophie's head snapped up instantly. She looked at him with wide, anxious eyes. Rowan approached the bed slowly, consciously softening his heavy stride. He sat on the very edge of the mattress, maintaining a respectful distance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant, muffled crashing of waves against the cliffs below. Then, Sophie reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small, crumpled drawing, a crayon sketch of a woman holding a little girl's hand under a bright yellow sun. She extended it toward him with a trembling arm. Rowan took the fragile piece of paper. His hardened fingers, which had broken bones and signed death warrants, held the drawing with terrifying gentleness. She's going to be okay, Rowan said, looking directly into the child's eyes. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep, but looking at this girl, he knew he would burn Seattle to the ground before he let her become an orphan. You're safe here, Sophie. No one can hurt you inside these walls. Sophie stared at him, and for the first time, her tiny shoulders relaxed. She leaned sideways, resting her head against Rowan's knee, her eyes finally fluttering shut. Rowan sat perfectly still, acting as a human shield against the dark, anchoring the child to the first safe haven she had ever known. The sterile, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor echoed in the private medical wing of the estate. It was 3 days before Tessa Collins finally opened her eyes. The bright ceiling lights made her wince, a sharp, localized pain throbbing behind her temples. Panic seized her chest. She gasped, trying to sit up, but a firm, steady hand gently pressed against her shoulder, anchoring her back to the mattress. Easy, a deep, gravelly voice commanded. You're safe. The bleeding has stopped. Tessa's vision cleared, focusing on the man sitting in the leather chair beside her bed. He was impossibly striking, dressed in a pristine black suit, his posture rigid and commanding. He looked dangerous, like a predator resting in the shadows, but his dark eyes held a strange, focused intensity that wasn't malicious. Where? Tessa choked out, her throat dry like sandpaper. Where is my baby? Where is Sophie? She's upstairs, sleeping, Rowan replied, his voice softening a fraction. My housekeeper is watching her. She hasn't left this estate since the night she stopped my car in the rain. The memory hit Tessa like a physical blow. The storm. The break-in. The splintering of the front door. A sob tore from her throat, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. He found us, she wept, the raw terror pouring out of her. I changed my name. I changed my job. We hid for months. But Brent, he always finds a way. Rowan remained perfectly still, but his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. Tell me. Through broken sentences and ragged breaths, Tessa confessed the nightmare she had lived through. She spoke of Brent Walker, a man who lived off her waitressing income, whose fragile ego was fueled by alcohol and violence. She described the years of bruises hidden under long sleeves, endured entirely so Sophie wouldn't bear the brunt of his rage. She told him of the secret savings, the midnight escape, and the brief, beautiful taste of freedom they had enjoyed in Seattle. Until Tuesday night, Tessa whispered, staring blankly at the ceiling. He broke through the kitchen window. He demanded the money I didn't have. When I told him to leave, he smiled. He grabbed me by the hair. I fought him, I swear I did, but he threw me against the counter. The world just went black. I thought he was going to kill Sophie next. He didn't, Rowan said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, sub-zero temperature. Your daughter is braver than most grown men I employ. She ran into a blizzard to save you. Tessa looked at him, tears tracking down her bruised cheeks. Who are you? Rowan stood up, drawing himself to his full, imposing height. He didn't answer her question. He didn't need to. The clinical indifference that usually governed his life had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculated fury. Brent Walker had not just beaten a woman, he had dared to bring his pathetic cowardice into Rowan's world, awakening a monster far worse than himself. Rest, Tessa, Rowan said quietly, walking toward the heavy door. Your hiding is over. I am taking care of it. The air in Rowan's private study was thick with the scent of unlit tobacco and cold espresso. On the massive mahogany desk, a single file folder lay open, illuminated by the harsh light of a green banker's lamp. Inside were grainy surveillance printouts, banking records, and a heavily stamped criminal rap sheet. Brent Walker. Rowan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the rain-slicked docks of Seattle. His hands were clasped loosely behind his back, his posture as still and unyielding as a marble monument. He crossed the state line 48 hours ago, Mingyu said, stepping into the room without a sound. He placed a freshly updated tablet on the desk. He used Tessa's stolen credit card at a gas station off Interstate 90 near Spokane. He's running, but he thinks he's invisible. Rowan turned around slowly. The cold, mechanical focus had returned to his eyes, but it was underpinned by a lethal, simmering heat. He isn't invisible. He's just a coward who hasn't realized the trap is already closing. I've already contacted our associates in eastern Washington, Mingyu continued, adjusting his tie. They're watching the bus terminals and cheap motels. Do you want them to bring him back here? No, Rowan said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. A piece of trash like that doesn't deserve to step foot on my property. I will handle him myself. Mingyu hesitated, a rare flicker of concern crossing his face. Boss, with all due respect, it's a 3-hour drive, and the syndicate meeting with the Yakuza representatives is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Tracking down a common domestic abuser is beneath your position. Let the enforcers deal with it. Rowan walked over to the desk, his gaze dropping to the photo of Brent Walker, a smirking, arrogant man who thought he could destroy lives without consequence. Rowan thought of Tessa's fractured skull, and he thought of Sophie standing alone in the blinding headlights, clutching his coat with freezing fingers. This isn't syndicate business, Mingyu, Rowan said, his tone carrying the terrifying, absolute finality of an executioner's gavel. This is personal. When my father beat my mother, the neighbors turned off their lights. The police looked the other way. The world decided she didn't matter. He picked up a sleek, black fountain pen, signed a single authorization order for the syndicate's private vehicles, and snapped the file shut. "I am the law in this city now," Rowan murmured, looking up at his underboss. "And I don't turn off the lights. Mobilize the shadow team. We leave in 10 minutes. Mingyu bowed deeply, recognizing the unshakable resolve in his don't face. "Yes, boss." As the door closed, Rowan looked down at the small crayon drawing Sophie had given him, still resting safely in his breast pocket. The net was cast. The monster was on the run, but he had no idea that the entire weight of the Seattle underworld was about to crash down upon his head. The neon sign of the Crossroads Motel buzzed with a dying flicker, casting an ugly, sickly yellow glow over the cracked asphalt of Spokane's industrial edge. It was a place where people went to disappear, a concrete graveyard for transients, drifters, and men running from their sins. Inside room 114, Brent Walker paced the cramped floor, a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey gripped in his hand. The television hummed with static in the corner, but his ears were tuned to the outside. Every time a car drove past on the highway, his muscles tightened. He took a heavy swig, wiping his mouth with the back of a bruised hand. He was panicking. When he had left that kitchen in Seattle, Tessa hadn't been moving. There had been so much blood. "Stupid bitch," he muttered to the empty room, trying to force anger over the knot of dread tightening in his stomach. It was her fault. If she just gave me the money. He stared at his duffel bag on the stained mattress. He needed to move again. The stolen credit card was hot, and he was running out of cash. But as he reached for the bag, a sudden, heavy silence fell over the motel lot. The distant sound of barking dogs abruptly cut out. The ambient hum of the highway seemed to vanish. Then, the electricity died. The television blinked out, plunging the room into absolute darkness, save for the weak, rhythmic flash of the yellow neon sign outside the curtained window. Brent froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. Yellow. Black. Yellow. Black. A low, mechanical rumble vibrated through the floorboards. Through the thin slit in the curtains, Brent saw it, a fleet of 4 identical, matte black SUVs pulling into the motel lot. They didn't have their headlights on. They moved like silent, armored reapers cutting through the fog. Before he could even breathe, the doors opened. Men in sleek, dark-tailored suits stepped out in perfect, terrifying formation. They didn't look like cops. They looked like an army of shadows. Brent stumbled backward, dropping the whiskey bottle. It shattered against the linoleum, the smell of alcohol filling the air. He lunged toward the bathroom window, desperate for an escape, but a sudden, deafening crack echoed through the room. The heavy wooden front door didn't just open, it splintered inward under the force of a tactical boot. 2 massive, silent enforcers stepped inside, their flashlight beams slicing through the shadows and pinning Brent against the bathroom door. He shielded his eyes, terrified, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Who are you? What do you want?" "I don't have any money." The enforcers didn't answer. They simply stepped aside, clearing a path. Through the shattered doorway walked Rowan Jin-Seo. He wore no coat against the eastern Washington chill, just his stark black suit. His hands were tucked casually into his pockets, his face an emotionless, terrifying mask carved from ice. He looked around the filthy room with profound disgust, his gaze finally landing on Brent. There was nowhere left to run. The net hadn't just closed, it had completely swallowed him. The air inside the abandoned warehouse on the edge of the Spokane River was freezing, thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. Rain lashed violently against the corrugated iron roof, mimicking the rhythm of the night Rowan's convoy had been halted. Brent Walker was bound to a heavy metal chair in the center of the vast, empty floor, illuminated by a single, harsh halogen bulb dangling from the rafters. His face was a mask of sweat and tear-streaked grime. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically between the heavily armed men standing like statues in the perimeter shadows. "Please," Brent whimpered, his voice echoing pathetic and small in the cavernous space. "Please, I don't know who you people are. Whatever she told you, she's lying." Tessa is a crazy bitch, she. The heavy click of leather shoes on concrete cut him off. Rowan stepped into the harsh cone of light. He had rolled up the sleeves of his black button-down shirt, exposing the sharp, clean lines of his forearms. His expression wasn't angry. It was worse. It was entirely vacant, the look of a man about to perform a purely clinical, necessary extraction. You speak about her with a lot of courage when she isn't here to defend herself, Rowan said, his voice a low, gravelly purr that made the hairs on Brent's neck stand up. I didn't mean to hit her that hard. Brent cried, shaking against his restraints. It was an accident. I swear to God, it was an accident. Rowan stopped inches away from him. He leaned down, placing his hands on the armrests of Brent's chair, bringing his face so close Brent could see the absolute, terrifying stillness in the dark pools of his eyes. When I was 7 years old, a man used those exact words, Rowan whispered. The ghost of his childhood apartment flitted across his mind, but it brought no weakness, only an unyielding, righteous fury. He said it was an accident. He said she provoked him. And then he walked away, leaving a child to pick up the pieces. Rowan straightened up, pulling a pair of heavy leather SAP gloves from his pocket and slowly pulling them over his knuckles. You think you are a monster, Brent. Because you intimidate women and terrorize a 5-year-old child, Rowan said, his tone dropping to a sub-zero freeze. But you don't know what a monster is. I am going to teach you. No. No, please. Just kill me. Don't do this. Brent screamed, thrashing wildly. Kill you? Rowan let out a short, humorless breath that looked like smoke in the freezing air. Death is a mercy. Death means you stop feeling. You don't deserve peace, Brent. Rowan turned to Mingyu, who stood waiting in the shadows. He is never to walk without a limp. He is never to hold a heavy object. And if he ever looks at a woman with anything but absolute, crippling terror for the rest of his miserable life, finish it. Rowan turned his back and walked away into the dark, ignoring the sudden, agonizing screams that echoed behind him, swallowed completely by the roaring Seattle storm outside. The relentless, bruising storm that had choked Seattle for weeks finally broke. A pale morning sun fractured the heavy cloud cover, casting long, golden beams across the manicured lawns of a quiet residential neighborhood far from the grid of the shipping docks. Rowan stood on the wraparound porch of a beautiful, colonial-style house, his hands resting in the pockets of a clean charcoal suit. For the first time in months, the air didn't smell of copper, rust, or rain, it smelled of damp earth and fresh pine. The front door opened softly behind him. Tessa stepped out onto the porch, holding a warm mug of coffee. The dark, horrific bruises that had once marred her face had faded into faint, memory-thin shadows, replaced by the natural color returning to her cheeks. She looked at the quiet street, then up at Rowan, her expression filled with a profound, quiet reverence. The movers just finished the last bedroom, Tessa said, her voice steady and free of the tremor that had defined it for years. Sophie is already organizing her books. She insists on putting the drawing she made for you on her desk. Rowan looked toward the large bay window. Inside, Sophie was laughing, chasing a sunbeam across the hardwood floor. Let her keep it there. It belongs in a house with light. Tessa took a slow breath, looking out over the peaceful neighborhood. A team of discreet, sharply dressed men in an unmarked sedan sat at the end of the block, Rowan's permanent, invisible security detail. Brent Walker was gone, broken so entirely by the wrath of the Jin-Seo syndicate that he would spend the rest of his days hiding from his own shadow. But the true healing hadn't come from Brent's destruction, it had come from the fortress Rowan had built around them. I still don't know how to repay you, Tessa whispered, a tear of relief slipping down her cheek. You saved my life. You gave my daughter a future. Rowan turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The clinical, unyielding Mafia don who ran the underworld with an iron fist was still there, but the hollow, haunted emptiness in his chest had vanished. The boy who had spent 20 years bleeding in the dark had finally found his peace. You don't owe me anything, Tessa, Rowan said quietly. For 20 years, I believed that power was only meant for survival. That hardening your heart was the only way to keep the dark from breaking you. He looked back at Sophie, who caught his gaze through the glass and gave him a bright, energetic wave. Rowan's lips curved into a rare, barely perceptible smile. But your daughter showed me something else, he continued, his voice dropping to a gentle, resolute murmur. She showed me that power is only real when you use it to stand between the innocent and the darkness. You are safe now. Both of you. Without another word, the cold king turned and walked down the steps, leaving the warmth of the sun behind him as he returned to his empire, no longer a monster of the shadows, but a lethal protector of the light.